Well, here we are with The Secret World of Oil, your new book on the seamy underside of the oil business. And so I'm going to ask you the first question that every author gets asked. You must be sick of answering. Why? Why did you decide to write this book?
Well, I have worked about I've written about the oil industry for a long time, for over a decade. And I've written about the corruption of the international oil industry and the way the United States maintains close relationships with various pretty unattractive regimes, and the basis of the relationship is oil. So, for example, when I was at the Los Angeles Times back in 2002, I think that's when I first started writing about the topic, and I wrote about the Obiang family of Equatorial Guinea, which is a small West African country, 500,000 people. Nobody knew about it or cared about it. It was a pariah state, terrible dictatorship, and dirt poor. And then in the mid-1990s, Exxon found a lot of oil off the coast of Equatorial Guinea, and other American companies poured in. And suddenly the relationship changed. Suddenly it was no longer a pariah, and there was this close, it's still not a friendly relationship because it's a little too embarrassing, but there was a rapprochement, and now President Obiang comes to Washington from time to time. And it was purely really a coincidence. I was looking at another story entirely. I was interviewing a former general whose firm had gotten a private contract to help Equatorial Guinea develop a coast guard. And he started telling me about the place, and I thought, how interesting. So I started writing about that, and probably spent, a lot of the past decade writing about similar topics from, Equatorial Guinea and Kazakhstan and Angola. I've been to Cambodia. I've been all over the world looking at this topic. So, like a lot of journalism stories, you get onto a topic, you start writing about it, people start bringing you tips, and you keep writing on it.
What is, there's a lot of talk in development economics about the resource curse. And we saw that firsthand with the Obiang family and with other countries that have discovered oil or natural gas or some other resource in the last 10, 20 years. I mean, can you talk about what does it do to a country? Does it actually make the people in the country better off? Or does it make them worse off because it frees their rulers from the need to any sort of accountability at all?
Well, in general, it has made countries worse off, but the key thing is, if you suddenly find oil in a country where there is really no form of democracy and no history of democracy, like Equatorial Guinea, where gains independence from Spain. It was a colony of Spain until the 60s. 1968, they gain independence, and this literally Idi Amin type character, a complete lunatic, takes power, terrorizes the country, and then 11 years later his nephew executes him, overthrows him, and then executes him, and has held power ever since. There's no tradition of democracy, so in that environment, when a government gets its hands on that sort of oil wealth, it's almost inevitable that it leads to corruption and very, very little improvement for people of the country. So in Nigeria, for example, oil firms have been pumping oil there for, I think, nearly half a century now. And the country is certainly worse off, not better off. I remember talking to a former CIA official who had traveled to Nigeria. He wasn't stationed there, but he worked for the office. It was then called, and still maybe called, the Office of Transnational Threats. And he went to Nigeria. And he said he concluded on the basis of conversations with people that the country would have been better off if they'd never discovered oil. So if, in a lot of places, as I note in the book, former Vice President Cheney once noted, God didn't see fit to put oil only in democratic countries friendly to the United States. And when the oil is found in Kazakhstan or Azerbaijan or Equatorial Guinea or Chad or Cameroon, the odds are it's not going to do the people a lot of good. There are some countries, Norway, which has a long history of democracy and citizen involvement. Norway's done pretty well on oil, but so it's not, it's not automatic. It really depends on the context and the environment.
The United States?
Well, I guess the United States is a mixed bag in some ways. certainly, and again, let me refer to a conversation I had as part of the book with a former Chevron executive, Ed Chow, who is now at I think he's at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and he talked about the difference between development of oil resources he was talking, I think, specifically about Central Asia, Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan, where Chevron has enormous concessions there, and they obtained them when he was at Chevron. And he said, look, the difference between Kazakhstan and the United States, or Central Asia and the United States, is, in the U.S., the oil resources are not owned by the state. The individual landowner in Texas or Louisiana gets royalties. And the companies pump the oil, the landowner gets the money. Sometimes there's not a huge environmental footprint. The companies are making money, they create jobs, and they create some wealth. Now, certainly you can look at Texas and Louisiana, which is a state I look at very closely in the book, and you can see in Louisiana there are certain elements of the traditional third world resource curse where the country has a lot of oil wealth, but it hasn't been shared very well. And in terms of social indicators, Louisiana ranks pretty low on just about everything in terms of health and education and per capita income.
But this has generally been a problem with Louisiana government, right? Is that just broadly there's a lot of corruption. It's very different from the rest of. I mean, I don't want to say there's no corruption anywhere else, but the political culture in Louisiana does seem to be very different from basically any other state in the U.S. So, I mean, is it broadly, when you look at Texas, when you look at those places, do you see the same level of problems, or is it?
No, definitely, and that's what getting at is that it's the political context. It's true. Louisiana has been notorious for corruption for a long time. And the United States is not we have all sorts of political problems, but we're not Kazakhstan just yet. And so, yeah, the wealth generated by oil has been better for people in the United States, certainly, than it's been for residents of oil-rich West African countries. So that political context is very important. Right. Which is not to say oil has not created problems as well, as everyone knows. I mean, from environmental problems, I guess would be the main one that people think about, and also, I guess that would be the main one in the United States that people worry about the most.
You don't talk so much about fracking, which surprised me a little bit. I mean, why did you decide? Because I suppose because that's the big, political issue in the U.S. right now. Did you think about doing more on it, or did you decide that really the focus was on conventional oil?
Well, the focus of the book really is looking at the middlemen. The book is called The Secret World of Oil because I'm trying and hopefully succeeded to some extent in shining a light on a part of the oil industry, really the natural resource industry that doesn't receive a lot of attention, which is the role of traders and intermediaries, middlemen, fixers, whatever you want to call them. These are people who sort of, there's a stratum between the companies and the governments in some of these more corrupt countries where, if you want an oil concession in Kazakhstan or Azerbaijan, it's not like you submit a bid and there's the government meets in a closed door and says, let's see what's going to be the best deal. You have to grease the wheels. I mean, there's no other way of putting it. You don't get an oil deal in Kazakhstan without making government officials wealthy. The old model was, well, we'll just transfer some money into your Swiss bank account. And now it's a lot more complicated. And the companies definitely, I'm not saying that every oil deal is legally corrupt. In spirit, they're probably all corrupt. But you cannot do business in many places in the world. And especially oil is such a sensitive commodity. I mean, oil and weapons are the two most important commodities to any government. You can't run your economy without oil, and you can't defend your borders without weapons. And partly because of that, there's a very centralized decision making. Only a few people are in on that, and especially in, again, these countries that I keep referring to, in Central Asia and West Africa, where you have either dictatorships or authoritarian governments, however you want to put it. You have very few people making decisions.